go to booktv.org. Until recently, Samantha Power was a foreign policy advisor to Barack Obama. The Pulitzer Prize-winning author discusses her latest book, Chasing the Flame. It talks about the life and work of UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Sérgio Vieira de Mello. The event, hosted by the New York Public Library, is 90 minutes.
To the stage now, it is my pleasure to ask you to warmly welcome Azar Nafisi together with Senior Foreign Policy Advisor to Barack Obama, Samantha Power.
Is this James Bond?
Spoken like an Iranian.
I very much look forward to that one. I think that we should sort of try to bring him in some way. It is wonderful to be here and hopefully to have a wonderful conversation between us and with you. I thought that maybe I'll begin by asking you a question. And halfway through reading Samantha's new book, Chasing the Flame, all of a sudden, I remembered something from a book that she doesn't like me to mention, which is A Problem from Hell, her previous book. I thought that the last sentences in Problem from Hell would be a fantastic introduction to Chasing the Flame. And so I want to begin with that. I don't know if you remember the end of your book, do you? Okay. I always try to forget the beginning and the end of mine. She says, this is the very, very last part. She says, George Bernard Shaw once wrote, "The reasonable man adapts himself to the world. The unreasonable one persists in trying to adapt the world to himself. Therefore, all progress depends on the unreasonable man." So I thought that, you know, in talking about this book and in talking about a character like Sérgio de Mello, and we will be going into his character much more, how would he fit into this description? Was he an unreasonable man? Does this description in any way tell us something about your book or him?
Wow, it's a great question. First of all, let me say that this audience is incredible. I'm so honored by it. I think Azar is as well. Of course, we hope that everybody's here because the perils of idealism are on everyone's mind, and you care about Sérgio or you love Azar.
And hate you.
And hate me. I'm sure there are a few Obama people out here as well, and we will acknowledge that that might be part of the draw, but, and I'm sure we'll get to Obama, who has an awful lot in common, actually, with Sérgio in certain ways. But you asked a great question. I think that on the one hand, so first a word about who Sérgio was, because the book's only been out, I think, 2 or 3 days. This was a guy who I think the James Bond music was in honor of Sérgio, in fact. Before I met him, I was in the former Yugoslavia, in the Balkans in 1994, and the UN mission there was something of a disaster. Peacekeepers had been put into harm's way on the logic that simply by being there, they would deter attacks against civilians. They weren't mandated to really use force in order to protect civilians, and the people intent on committing aggression were also intent on using force. So the peacekeepers were mainly there delivering humanitarian aid, and as I think Henri Lévy described it as passing out sandwiches at the gates of Auschwitz. That was what the UN was said to be doing. So I was a journalist, I was young, I was maybe shrill, I found it very disturbing what we in the world were allowing happen to these innocents. The Problem from Hell is about that in large measure. But the UN was the symptom of the international community's indifference is too strong, but insufficient regard for these people. And so I was told that there was this one kind of exceptional character within this otherwise faltering, unimpressive mission, and that was a person who was a cross between Bobby Kennedy on the one hand and James Bond on the other. And I thought, wow, you know, that doesn't sound like a UN profile to me. Let me go and find this person, and we met and became friends over the years. He was a guy whose life moved with the headlines. Wherever the world's worst crises were, Sérgio was. And what's interesting is a biography of Sérgio does indeed end up being a biography of the world of the last 35 years. So he was a Brazilian. His father was fired by the Brazilian Foreign Service when the military took over there in a coup. Sérgio thus developed this attitude about Brazil, which is that even though he spoke 7 languages and became a great diplomat, he would never work for his country. He would never work for the state. He didn't trust states. He didn't trust politics. In 1968, he was in Paris doing philosophy work at the Sorbonne and became part of the student riots. And he hated imperialism, he hated the United States, he hated the state. He continues to hate the state as an abstraction. And he would, even when he would see an American car in Europe, he would bend over and pretend as if he was picking up stones and kind of hurl them, imaginary stones, at these cars. And if he heard an American accent, he would get up and leave the table. But for him, the alternative to the state, and this was his first act of unreasonableness perhaps, was, or of naivete in some ways, the alternative to the state and to politics for him was the UN in his youthful mind. The idea was the UN was the place we parked our principles. That was where we were supposed to hold states accountable or prevent them from being state-like. And so he was drawn, and having been expelled from Paris by virtue of involvement in the riots, he joined the UN at age 21. And then, as I said, moved with the headlines. So if in the 70s the conflicts that were consuming the world were wars of decolonization and so forth, he was the guy dealing with the humanitarian consequences of those. So he was in Bangladesh in the early 70s. He was in Cyprus right after the invasion there. He was in Sudan when the civil war started there, which we're still dealing with to this day. Mozambique, the War of Independence. And he would spend a year, 2 years, 6 months in these places. He called this period of his life the grocery delivery period. It was humanitarian aid. He was, in some ways, always aware that there was a danger of passing out sandwiches at the gates of Auschwitz. Then a turning point for him comes, and this is the unreasonable, I think gets to your question directly, when he's in Lebanon in 81, from 81 to 83. Palestinians are staging raids out of southern Lebanon, attacks into northern Israel. The Israelis decide they're going to respond by invading southern Lebanon and getting rid of what had been a UN buffer, because the buffer wasn't doing any good. The attacks were coming. And Sérgio was, like the rest of the UN, kind of trampled by the invasion. Only one fatality, but an awful lot of indignity in the process. And he went marching up to the Israeli commander who had come into southern Lebanon, who was standing in front of a tank at a sort of corner. And Sérgio said, "What you're doing, this invasion, this is unacceptable." And the general just looked at this little Brazilian UN guy and said, "If you think this is unacceptable, you should see the 50 tanks that are pulling up the rear here. That's unacceptable." And Sérgio said from that point on, he would never use the word unacceptable again. This idea that there was a standard of reason that could be applied. And just briefly, just because not everybody knows Sérgio. So after Lebanon, he was then after southern Lebanon, he was in Beirut in 83 when the Marine barracks, when the US embassy was hit by the first suicide bomber, Hezbollah. It later emerged. And then the Marine barracks were hit. Wall falls in 1989. He's the guy sent to kind of clean up the consequences of the Cold War proxy wars. He's the one sent to negotiate with the Khmer Rouge, to stare into the eyes of evil and figure out what the hell do you do with them now that there's a peace, now that the US and the Soviets are no longer backing different sides, and even the Chinese are out of it. Now Cambodia is just stuck with itself and with the residue. So he had to decide how to negotiate with them. Then when I met him in the 90s, people remember, some people here are too young now to remember, but the big issue was ethnic conflict and Isaiah Berlin's bent twig, you know, under when societies had been closed, and then you open them and then the twig snaps and you get all this killing. So he was in Bosnia for 2 years. He was in Rwanda and in the Congo, figuring out what do you do with the genocidaires who are involved with the genocide, and then go into neighboring countries amid civilians, amid 2 million civilians who, some number of whom haven't done anything, but a lot of whom were involved in the genocide. How do you separate the sheep from the wolves? You had to kind of figure that out. And then, to finally getting near the present, nation, I mean, this guy is insane. The nation-building experiments of the late 1990s, Sérgio was the Jerry Bremer predecessor, the sort of equivalent of Bremer, the viceroy in Kosovo, which is in the news today, and in East Timor, which is sadly in the news today. Then, of course, he becomes Human Rights Commissioner, has to figure out what do you do with George Bush and Guantanamo and the Geneva Conventions and rendition, Do you denounce him from afar as a UN guy, or do you try to get in the room? Sergio's preference was always to be in the room, and then culminating, of course, in Iraq. Now, that's a biography, but so he's everywhere. Now, I wouldn't have known he was in half these places when I met him. He wasn't one of these macho, he was macho, but he wasn't one of the macho guys who kind of lords their war experience over you. But I think what makes him amazing is he actually believed that you could reason with the Khmer Rouge. You could reason with Muqtada al-Sadr. You could reason with George Bush, not to put Muqtada and George Bush in the same, that was not intentional. But the point is, people that everybody else would deem unreasonable in profound ways, I think perhaps there was a hubris to him in exaggerating the power of reason. And arguably, and we'll get to it later I assume, but when he's blown up in Iraq, it's in some ways the product of trusting that the UN flag, which by the way in the meantime he's learned is not simply where we park our ideals, it's not the opposite of the state, it's the embodiment of state power, it's the accretion of 192 states. And in fact, the only way to do anything for anybody and to prevent violence and deal with broken people in broken places is to somehow mobilize the very states that he had turned his back on in the first place, like as a young leftist. So he trusts in reason. He gets 2 PhDs while he's doing all of this, one on Kant and one on Hegel. I mean, who is this guy? Like, what's he? How does one do that? And so he's deeply steeped in political theory and in the possibility of kind of ordering the world around ideas as well as ideals. And yet he's in the world's worst places, seeing unreason playing itself out. And I guess the basic answer is how, I mean, his whole life is the triumph of hope over experience. So in that sense, he's pushing Sisyphean boulders up hills. They're coming back down, and he's, you know, back up again. And you and I talked about this a little bit before, but what's so interesting is that it's tempting to say, oh God, there's a world so hard, let's just, if he can't do it, and he's got all these gifts and he's been in all these places, maybe we should just disengage or give up or whatever. But what I think is so instructive is this is what reasonable will look like in the 21st century. Reasonableness will look like. This is what success, sadly, in a lot of societies is going to look like. A lot of 2 steps forward, 3 steps back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And so I think some people engage with Sergio and they just think, oh, you know, if he can't do it, how are the rest of us to do it? But the point is, there's only one guy. You know, how do we expand the ranks of the unreasonable? Again, to the same question.
Yeah, it's interesting, the idea of unreasonable, because the way Shaw uses the unreasonable, I think that the idea would be the imaginative man, the man who sees the world from the alternative point of view, or through the fresh eyes. So that sort of an unreasonableness never accepts the habitual world that is in front of him. You know, nowadays in foreign policy we have this world when we say we have realists or pragmatists. By realism and pragmatism we mean that ideas should be pushed aside or idealism should not exist. And then we have so-called idealists who, you know, all through reading this I was thinking, okay, man of ideas, people you would call neoconservatives, they were men of ideas, and they were idealists. What went wrong with them? And I think what went wrong with them was that you need to have this paradox of reality and ideas. You need to understand that there is a paradox between what is real and what you want it to be. And if you impose your own figment of imagination on reality, you destroy it. You know, and that is what happened with Iraq, because so many people wanted Iraq to be a specific thing, which it wasn't. And they would not accept reason in relationship to it. They weren't necessarily bad men or, you know, good men. It was just that the worst thing you can do is to impose your figment of imagination. And you have a point in the book where you say when Rumsfeld saw what happened, you know, about the world, he decided that we need to take preventive measures so we'll destroy them before they destroy us. When Sergio saw what happened, he did not reach the conclusion that we will destroy them the way they will destroy us. He used what you mentioned in the book, using philosophy as intersubjectivity, using philosophy as empathy, that you need to understand the other, you need to even understand your enemy. In order to defeat them, you need to understand them. So that is why I think he is so central to the world today. If you want to have a foreign policy, you cannot think about this idea. I always think that, this idea of the right of every individual for life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Well, some people to the right believe in it sincerely and think that they should impose the right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness on other people. They impose the rights, they take away life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Then the realists or pragmatists use a cultural relativism, which you mention in the book. These are the ideas that I would hope that you will address when we come back. The idea of cultural relativism, where they say, oh, if in Saudi Arabia a woman who is raped is going to be lashed and imprisoned because she's raped, or in Iran, if you stone a woman to death, or in Darfur, if a woman is starving, well, that's their culture. We need to respect their culture, and not criticize it. So they justify what happens by artificially paying respect to something that is not their culture. Their culture is Ibn Sina and Hafiz and Rumi. Their culture is not stoning women to death as much as America's culture then is burning witches in Salem. That's what I could say. Or, Harriet Beecher Stowe, when she came out for the rights of women, you could tell her, Bible says women's place is at home. That wasn't the Christian culture, definitely. Nowadays, we have an African-American candidate and a woman, and we're all celebrating it. Why is it so surprising that an African-American and a woman are running? If this was American culture from time immemorial, then would we be surprised that these two are running, make such a big deal out of it, So, I'm sorry. I want to then come back to the question of Sergio and the unreasonable man. That he is unreasonable in an imaginative way. He uses ideas to change reality. And he uses reality to understand ideas. I think that is maybe the difference, or is it? Because I have a lot of flack to give him later on. I mean, he made me so mad. This was like a mystery book. I wanted to know what is he going to do next. And sometimes what he did next, I literally felt that this is giving food at the door of Auschwitz, So there is that big problem there too.
Wow. I think, one of the things that Azar and I have an awful lot in common, I hope, but one of the things that we have in common that we never thought we would have in common is that we've both, by being human rights advocates, have actually been cast by the neocon brush. That is, if there's a... Yeah, or whomever, but if policy or politics or advocacy is a Venn diagram, and you'd have, the people who advocated the war in Iraq here for a range of reasons, and then one of the reasons might be, at least stated, and in some cases even sincere, the welfare of Iraqis. And then you'd have a circle of people who are, thinking about a lot of things, national security as well, but also thinking quite centrally about human rights. There are those who argue that we make Wolfowitz and Richard Pearl possible somehow by being human rights advocates. That my book was used by Dick Cheney, my last book, A Problem from Hell. My new problem from hell is that I can't get people to stop talking about the old problem from hell, so I can get them talking about the new, Chasing the Flame. That's my real problem from hell at present. But the point is they will take, I documented Saddam Hussein's genocide against the Kurds in that book in very graphic detail, and so what they do is they selectively look at that part and say, look, we want to go to war for this reason, that reason, the other thing, but look, he gassed his own people, not mentioning that we doubled our aid to his regime in the immediate aftermath of the said gassing, and not mentioning that the same individuals who were arguing for the invasion of Iraq in 2003 were the same officials in the Reagan administration who were part of the doubling of aid to his regime in the aftermath of that. But I mention that because this question of, you know, how to rehabilitate terminology, concepts, morality, to use a dirty word, human rights, although the Bush administration tends to talk more in terms of liberty and freedom than of the human rights framework, which invokes notions of international law and so forth. And what Sergio taught me, I mean, I've just been walking in this guy's footsteps now for 4 years and meeting all the people he worked with in these missions, each of whom have some, at least subset of his experiences in broken places, but is the degree to which, if I had to pick a concept, and this I say at the end of the book as a kind of takeaway, more than democracy certainly, and more than liberty, all of which are, we like democracy for liberty, and even more than human rights, I would make the cornerstone concept dignity. Dignity. And Sergio was hugely sensitive to dignity, I think for a lot of different reasons. First, being Brazilian, you know, being the person who was seen to be one from the developing world, being a UN guy in a world of big states and tanks and things from countries, and how the UN was treated in the field a lot of the time, being a humanitarian when humanitarianism seemed like grocery delivery and high politics was someplace else. I mean, he was an amazing kind of cross-dresser. He could play up his Sorbonne education if he was with French and American diplomats, or French diplomats, perhaps not American, that wouldn't work in certain circumstances, but some Americans. But then when he was with Kabila in the jungle in Congo, he was talking about, I'm a Brazilian, these Americans, these French, these colonizers, I know how you know Portugal. You know, he had this amazing ability to, again, find this common ground. But so I think he was himself very sensitive to his own dignity and the times that it was trampled. And I think it gave him quite early a capacity to, and this is what you were alluding to triangulate to this intersubjectivity point, which is an abstract way that he put it in his philosophy writings, but to put himself in the shoes of people and say, how would I feel, not simply if I were Iraqi and living under US occupation, but how would I feel if I were Timorese and living under UN occupation? Turns out, the UN flag, again, is where, that is, the UN is where we park our ideals and self-determination, rah-rah, fundamental freedoms and so forth, but they're still not governing themselves in East Timor. And initially, Sergio, when he got there, would have thought, but I'm the UN. Everyone likes the UN. We helped get rid of the Indonesians. We supported the referendum. And what he learned was that there's a statute of limitations on patience when someone is standing in the way of you and your own destiny. And I think if you look at, for instance, what I mentioned in the Congo context, I recognize there are all these places that he is, and it's floating around from one continent to the next, one era to the next. But in the Congo context, when you've got the genocidaire living amid the civilians, among the civilians, you have to make a judgment. And usually in the grocery delivery community and the humanitarian community, the judgment is feed. We must feed at all costs. And there's a certain amount of pride. We see it today in Darfur. The Bush just said it in Africa. We've spent $3 billion sustaining these camps in Darfur and in Chad, and much more. I mean, triple, quadruple, 10 times perhaps the amount of other countries and even other rich countries. But the idea that that would be a source of pride, it's only a source of pride if you make humanitarianism the cornerstone concept. But if you think in terms of dignity, if you inject a regard for how those people are living in those camps, that's not a life for these people. That's what you're saying. It's like somehow, I mean, I've actually heard and traveled with people into these camps, and they say, oh, but I mean, life is actually better for them in the camps because they got running water that's delivered, and you know, they had to go to the well in their villages. It's like, that was their village, that was their life, that was the life that they chose, that was the life that they value, that's the life, if you would actually talk to them and listen to them, that's the life they tell you they'd like to go back to. So when you, just coming back to your point about neocons and so forth, because when you do the democracy promotion initiative, when you do the freedom doctrine, you're talking about freedom, you're talking about all these principles. I mean, you know, also from living in Iran, but when you talk down to somebody about the importance of them having freedom, it's an affront to their dignity. Whereas if you could imagine once we rehabilitate the concepts and Obama becomes president and we close Guantanamo and stop torturing and get out of Iraq responsibly and do all those things on Monday, then imagining how you could actually bring dignity, a concern about dignity into the room. I mean, even Guantanamo and the things that I've mentioned. I mean, torture and even lesser forms that don't make it into the realm of torture. But the sort of trampling on culture, and I guess what you mentioned, realism and idealism. Forgive me for just going on this, but the concepts are so important. It's such a false dichotomy, and Sergio saw this. It's a crazy dichotomy. The idea that it is a realist thing to do, that it is in your national security interests to detain people at will, not give them fair processes, be broadcast around the world that you're torturing them, have the vice president call waterboarding a no-brainer. The idea that that's good for your national security long term, when we've already identified that the threat is that people who want to come and kill us try to come and kill us, and the more people who want to come and kill us and who feel that their dignity is trampled will perhaps pursue that objective. You know, it's trying to, I think what Sergio saw is the degree to which, I think you wrote down on one of your notes, you know, that there's no such thing as a distant crisis, that we are implicated, and that it's not a question of to be engaged or to be involved or not to be involved. It's a question of how to be involved. Are you actually thinking in terms of dignity? Are you thinking empirically instead of ideologically? Are you actually asking what is working? And one final thing, because it relates to your country, and I want to ask you a question. When I worked with Obama in the Senate, one of the most cringeworthy moments that I experienced there, and there were many because the Democrats were in the minority, and of course Barack was the sum of everyone's hopes and dreams, but he was still the junior senator from Illinois. The Republicans who chaired the committees deferred to the White House on issues related to national security, big time. So there were a lot of indignities, in fact, to put it mildly, of getting the gavel taken out of your hand, you know, having your microphone turned off if you were talking, God forbid, about detainee policies and so forth. But one of the worst moments, and that's by way of question for you, Azhar, was when Condoleezza Rice came up to Capitol Hill and testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and Obama and she had an amazing exchange in which basically everyone on the committee, he was the last to get to ask his question, everyone had challenged her democracy promotion initiatives and said, how's it going, effectively, empirically, how's it working? Where is the evidence now? It seems like extremists and anti-American elements, in fact, are winning in the elections that you're pushing down people's throats. Iraq obviously not going terribly well. What's Afghanistan taking the eye off the ball, et cetera. Challenging. And in every response, she would come back and say, well, Senator, you clearly want to return to the era of mass graves and torture. I, on the other hand, stand for democracy. And it was so many non sequiturs that by the time it got to Obama, he said to her, coming to Iran here in a second, but he said to her, before I start, because her response was the same again and again to all the country, let me just stipulate that I'm against mass graves. I'm against the era of torture. I'm against brutal dictatorships that use chemical weapons against their own people. Now, can we talk about the democracy promotion initiative of today and not create, again, these straw men? So what she does is she ends up boasting and so proud as a way of a deliverable to say, well, we've just given, and you'll give me the number, but $25 million or $50 million to the Iranian dissidents, to the Iranian opposition. And Obama turns to me and he's like, what? What? I mean, what better, surefire way to marginalize the opposition? I mean, whatever about giving the aid, but to be up on Capitol Hill boasting about it. And it's not empirical. It's not consequences oriented. It's about the need to thump your chest and say, we've just given $50 million to the Iranian opposition. Isn't that great, Azhar? You're Iranian. Doesn't that make you happy that we're supporting democracy in Iran? I mean, how do you react when you hear this? Just to put you on the spot here.
Well,
Speechless, Azhar, speechless.
No, because actually, I'll come back to how I react by responding to you about exactly, you began to respond to me by talking about human rights and the way that after the war in Iraq especially, human rights in many circles has become a dirty word. If you talk about the fact that women in Iran right now are asking for 1 million signatures because of the repressive laws there, people actually stand up and ask you, but aren't you helping Bush invade Iran? You know, so that idea is as shallow as thinking that offering money to, I don't know who, to these vague personalities or not so vague personalities will bring freedom to Iran. Because the idea of freedom should be seen as a process. I mean, I disagree with many things Sartre says, but I do agree with the fact that he says the means are the end is the sum total of the means employed. If you want to keep the Iranian people's dignity, you do not liberate them, because the only way a people can gain freedom is to liberate themselves. But you support them. You give voice to people who have been silenced. You know, and that is only done through understanding the culture. Now, understanding the culture in some parts of our academia nowadays is, oh, the Sharia laws, I mean, if they want to reduce the age from 18 to 9, that's their culture. Bloody hell, it's not my culture. You know, and if it is my culture, I'm going to fight against it the way that the abolitionists fought against the slavery, the way that Susan Cady Stanton fought for women's rights. If you guys think that waterboarding is not dignified for the American people to impose it on others, it's not dignified for my people to be tortured. It's not dignified for an Iranian woman to be told how to worship her God. So that is where we're coming from. If people want to respect us, they don't offer us, you know, bits and pieces of liberation. I don't want people to feel sorry for us. You know, I mean, people in Iran are victims of oppression, but the only way they're liberating themselves is by resisting being a victim. So that whole resistance is an existential matter, as Václav Havel or Miloš or all the other experiences in the world say. So I think that is the problem. But I think people in this country and in the West are giving up on their own sense of dignity when they don't think that fighting for human rights in Darfur or in Iran or in Afghanistan is not part of their struggle. I remember there was a wonderful sentence, I don't have it with me, by Italo Calvino, where he was talking about your liberation is not possible without the liberation of others. If you are so segregated now that you do not see yourself as part of the world, if you do not have that power of empathy, then there is something deeply wrong with this culture. I think the way this culture views the others is a reflection of the way it views itself. And I think that Americans perhaps are very cynical about the idea of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, while that Persian student in Iran, who right now as we speak is in jail because of life, liberty, and happiness, you know, is paying more attention to the dignity of this country than this country is. I think it's shameful to treat human rights in this manner. But I want to, I'm sorry, this is from your own book. I would rather tell you to read it, but I'm going to read it to save time. No, because I can skip the parts.
I can't.
Sergio goes to the refugees camps in Azerbaijan.
Oh, I love
it is amazing. I mean, because Samantha brought the question of dignity, it's very important to understand what we mean by dignity.
Take it away.
He talks with a woman, and he talks to her, and this is the kind of person, woman refugee, and this is the kind of person he is. They move on. He wants to go back. He goes back to the woman, and that is what he says. He asks the woman, what do you miss the most? I am a proud person, she said through a translator. My whole life I've lived alone and I've worked the land myself. I have never depended on anybody for anything. And now here I am for 3 years, dependent on handouts from the UN. It's very hard. She looked down at the ground. And what do you want for yourself, he asked. She looked straight at him. and said simply, I want to go up into the sky and become a cloud. And then, as a cloud, I want to travel through the sky many miles to where my home is. And when I see my land, I want to turn into rain and fall from the sky, landing in the soil so I can remain forever in the place that I belong. Now, I'm so...
Yeah, you can't make this shit up, as they say. Sometimes. That's my, I mean, you can't, this is a 78-year-old Azeri refugee, you know, and Sergio's in this limousine. He's the big shot. At that time, I think he was Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs. He's sort of like a 2-star or a 3-star in the UN system. And he met her, and he just had a feeling, and then went away, and they were saying, you gotta go, we're gonna go to the capital, we're gonna meet with the Prime Minister. He's like, I wanna go back, I wanna talk to that woman. And that was, you know, what the woman said. I mean, what to say? It's this, but it's a balancing act, right? And I wanted to interrupt you before. While I agree with so much of what you've said about, well, certainly everything you've said about the importance of stirring empathy here, as you know, there is this sort of incredible anti-genocide movement that has come out of nowhere in the last 5 years. And I think what it's reflective of is, on the one hand, it's a symptom of that yearning that a lot of people have felt over the years, but specifically after 9/11, that desire to do something, that desire to be a part of fixing American foreign policy, to be a part of doing away with the false dichotomies between realism and idealism and us and them and so forth. I mean, remember on September 12th or September 11th itself, people are lining up in this city, not just the city, in Idaho, everywhere, to give blood. Like, that's how badly they want to give. They want to be a part of something. They want to do something. And, of course, we were told to go shopping. We were told that, and have been told even recently in the last year, that we are sacrificing. We are sacrificing because we have to watch these ghastly television images at night from Iraq and Afghanistan, that we're somehow a part of carrying the national security burden. We're not. We aren't. We just aren't. Most of us, except those of you who are, you know, part of military families and so forth. I mean, it's just a tiny sliver of our society carrying this burden, and this hunger, untapped. I think this is what Obama has tapped into, is just, we want to be part of a movement. I mean, now Obama's getting grief for the movement being kind of almost cultish and the fervor. But what it is this unleashed passion and desire to be part of change. And I think the genocide, the anti-genocide movement, which again, it seems like a small issue relative to the larger foreign policy calamities that the United States is associated with, but I think it felt for a lot of people like it was someplace where you could do good without having, Iraq was so complicated for people. They thought, okay, I may have been against the war to begin with, but if I'm against genocide and I don't want the Iraqis to suffer any more than they already have, what am I supposed to be for now? I mean, how do I think about withdrawal? I know for a lot of people it's very obvious that withdrawal is the right thing to do from the standpoint of Iraqis. For a lot of people it's not obvious. They never wanted to be there in the first place, and they're thinking, will it make life worse, and will the people getting us out actually be more careful getting out than they were getting in? Will they think about the Iraqis at any stage? They didn't think about them during the gassing in the 80s. They didn't think about them during the sanctions. They didn't think about them during the invasion. What on earth? Why are we supposed to assume that the U.S. government is going to think about the Iraqis as they get out of Iraq? And so it all got channeled into this Darfur movement or the anti-genocide movement. So it's out there. The question is, there's no movement around Guantanamo. There's no movement around rendition.
There is movement against. There's movement about pulling out of Iraq, but there is no movement about doing something for the Iraqi people.
Right. No, that's what yes. I think people are just think, it's too hard. Let me go to something that seems easier.
And what you say, and it shows that people do empathize with genocide. The difficult thing, and I wanted to ask you, I mean, I know that we have to open up to you guys and start, creating a dialogue there, but I wanted to, at least at the end of our talk, to come to this question, because I do empathize. I mean, I don't think that all politicians are really horrible men who sit there and think, how do we make it You know, how do we steal more money, more oil, more this? How do we, you know, have affairs without anybody finding out about it and things like that? You know, I don't think they really like that. And I do understand the paradox of being, in policy, being a state. When you're a state, you don't have the freedoms that a human rights activist does, because we can say anything, but they have to implement a lot of things, and they have to deal with evil, which I would want to come back with. So the question that I have, for example, with Obama, now, he says, I don't know about his foreign policy. I know that he talks about talking with everyone, which is a good idea in principle.
Yeah.
In principle, it's a good idea. What I worry about is never talking to others. What I worry about is how much context do you have? And would you, firmness does not mean deletion, military attack, belligerence. Firmness means that there are certain principles that you need to keep while you talk. Otherwise, like Sergio, you'll be walking the streets wanting to find a gift for Milosevic. You know, you talk to evil. So evil men are very seductive. You know, they don't have something written on their foreheads, evil beware. And everybody is so surprised because you talk to these people and they're civil, they quote poetry, some are philosophers, you know, they're just ordinary people like you, they fall in love and out, and then you say, oh, they're like me, so they can't be bad. Exactly, because they're like you, they can also be bad. You know, because we all are capable of a lot of things. So the question with me is, what do you do? What is the difference between Obama talking to heads of states? Mrs. Albright tried it. Mrs. Albright even danced with evil. You remember in North Korea, she danced.
Right.
You know, I was outraged in a sense, but she tried to talk to everyone. What is the difference between...
Well, maybe it's a great question, and I don't think that there's a one-size-fits-all answer, obviously. I mean, I think we're...
How do we see
right. But I think maybe Sergio is a good vehicle. I mean, in a way, I mentioned him comically in the early 80s storming up with the UN Charter in his pocket and saying, thou must not do X or Y, you know, and that was the fervor with which he ran around with international laws and principles and so forth. And then, as you suggested just now, he changed and he became much more accommodating. He tried to always find these ways of connecting interpersonally before he went to the politics and to the really tough issues. So, as you suggested, he went traipsing around Belgrade to try to find Milosevic, the perfect painting, Slobodan Milosevic, the Serbian president. When he went to see Radovan Karadzic, the Bosnian Serb leader, the very first time, he knew that this huge extremist, militant nightmare, Karadzic, had been a psychiatrist before he became a monster. And Sergio went looking, what can I bring Karadzic? I'm going to the Bosnian Serb capital for the first time. And he found a copy of the New York Review of Books that had on its cover this cover story on psychoanalysis, and he proudly presented Karadzic, was thrilled, he's in isolation, sanctions. Suddenly you get the New York Review of Books in the middle of this war, and this is where Azza was talking about her rage with Sergio, and I felt it as well, both in Bosnia at the time and then in going back over the book, to do the book. But he, what's really interesting is after Rwanda and Srebrenica, there is a shift in Sergio, and it's not, he's walking down the beach like Stephen Dedalus, and he has this epiphany, and he writes it down, and he broadcasts it from the heavens. But what happens, and this brings me back to Obama, is that he maintains his belief that you have to be in the room with everyone, but he is much less prone to black box. This was something he used to prize, this idea of black boxing, that you just put in a black box intentions and how much blood they have on their hands. If you're going to forget about that. You gotta forget about it. You know, how are you going to move on if you're forever bringing up the crimes of the past? Well, the woman who wants to become a cloud, the people who want to return to their homes, the people who've been already victimized or have been tortured or genocided or whatever, they've got a very different point of view. It's not just about peace, it's about what kind of peace and how lasting is the peace going to be if there are all of these grievances. So again, coming back to Obama, what Sergio by the end would do is he goes into the room, he's prepared still to talk to everybody because he feels like you simply can't know, as you say, your foe, your challenge, your hurdle, your obstruction. You can't know these people, you can't know the contours of how you're going to circumnavigate, break into, seduce, until you're in the room. You're just inevitably going to gain knowledge of some kind. But what you can't do is check your principles at the door. And this is where I think there's been a lot of confusion about Obama, and I think he's been incredibly straight about this from the beginning, but I don't think it filters down so much. His point has always been twofold. One, we treat sometimes meeting with the United States as if it's like a great privilege for people. It's a great reward. You get to meet with a president, or you get to meet with a Secretary of State, and it kind of gets the order wrong. I mean, if you look at the great breakthroughs in American diplomatic history, when Nixon goes to China, granted there's a whole lot of diplomatic work that precedes that, but the breakthroughs come after the seminal meetings. If Khrushchev and Kennedy, you know, if we were like, Khrushchev's evil, he's the evil empire, we can't talk to him, who knows where we'd be today. Reagan, even, in terms of arms control negotiations, arms negotiations. We meet with our foes, and that serves two purposes. One, as I said, it's intelligence gathering. Actually, three purposes. Two, you don't check your principles at the door. If you meet with Ahmadinejad, you talk about Holocaust denial immediately, in public settings, in private settings. You don't humiliate him. You know, you don't set him up like we might have done in this town recently. I mean, that's, again, a dignity issue. Even this is where Sergio would have been very, very sensitive.
Like him,
yeah, you become like, you know, like him up to a point anyway, analogous to him in some way. But he's a Holocaust denier, he's a supporter of Hamas and Hezbollah, he's an infiltrator of Iraq, although I do find it is ironic when you've invaded a country to talk about Iran as an infiltrator of Iraq. That's a hard argument to make, but it's true, and it's destructive, and people are paying the price for that. So you're saying all those things, and you're not checking your principles at the door, and you're very conscious of the possibility of a propaganda victory, or a dance, a waltz with a dictator, and how he's going to use that. But the third point, so you're actually bringing your principles in the room, but the third point is, by meeting with him, you remind the world, this is Obama's point, this was Sergio's point, you remind the world that Ahmadinejad is the problem, not the United States of America. In other words, that you change the orientation so then people are back to problem solving around support for Hamas and Hezbollah. They're back to having a discussion about why he's a Holocaust denier, and that's outrageous. And most countries in the world, their publics now are sympathetic to Ahmadinejad. I mean, we've made somebody who's not objectively sympathetic profile of quality. I mean, he just doesn't have the goods to be sympathetic, but by our sort of standing across the room with arms folded and wagging our finger, and in the larger context of American foreign policy, it's been counterproductive. It's strengthened him domestically, from everything you tell me and I read, and it's made us the object of derision internationally. So I think if you want to sanction Ahmadinejad, if his weapons of mass destruction program gets back in gear, the way to build that international coalition is to have shown everybody that in good faith you're in the room. And that's been Obama's point. It's not that you go into the room without preparation. You just don't make the condition of going in the room what you would hope to be the outcome of the negotiation in the first place. And that was Rabin's point. You don't make peace with your friends. They're already your friends. You don't need to. I mean, we may now. But
it is very difficult because, especially about Iran, the debate is if we have dialogue with them, you compromise, you keep quiet. Like in Soviet Union, you would have dialogue with Khrushchev, and you would also have a dialogue with Miloš and Medvedev and Solzhenitsyn.
Exactly. So
you would send a message to the people that you respect them, but at the same time, not give them money. You were giving them cultural support, ideological support. Because the greatest weapon this country has is cultural.
Right.
The greatest weapon this country has, if it has it, is liberty. It's not weapons. Everybody has weapons, including Al-Qaeda. You know. So, shall we open on this note? Should we open it up to? Paul, what do you think?
I think we can, or you can speak some more.
Well, I think that
is there a microphone?
there should be.
How do we do?
I mean, what we could do, I don't know if it works, but what we could do, we could carry on a three-way conversation if you want to. have a question from the audience and the two.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. No, I think let's open it up. Right? People may hate what they're hearing,
Let's open it up.
and that would be bad.
There's a light there. There's a light there, and a light is shining.
Would you love to talk about the way he
Hi.
the way he died, too?
I actually have a question for Ms. Nafisi. I understand Christopher Hitchens said that in your book you thanked Paul Wolfowitz, and I was wondering if you could say something, if you could tell us why and tell us maybe something nice about the man.
No, first of all, you know, if Samantha hasn't said it yet, but one thing that attracted me, I know a lot of things that I say come out as political, but I don't consider it political. I consider, as a woman and a writer and a human being, there are certain rights and certain principles that are existential and not political. They sometimes come into contradiction with politics. And I don't like to turn anyone, not even Ahmadinejad, into a caricature. So, you know, we say Paul Wolfowitz, we all laugh as if we're all in a conspiracy together, you know, and the man is reduced. And by reducing him, we reduce ourselves. If you want me to say something nice about him, when Paul Wolfowitz was the dean at ʻsɛʁʒu, which I think he should have not left, I didn't have much contact with Paul Wolfowitz after he left ʻsɛʁʒu. When he went into Pentagon, I only saw him once or twice in public meetings and conferences. I've never had any, you know, relation with him. I only saw him when he was dean, talked to him personally when he was the dean, and he was a very liberal-minded, and he was very pro-human rights, and he did not impose himself on us. So, for example, me and two of my friends, I'm quote-unquote a liberal in everything almost. I mean, in terms of women's rights, gay rights, stem cell, foreign policy, the Iraq war. I had a friend who worked there, Katrina Vogeli, who was the head of a Swiss foundation. She was anti-American European type personality, and all of us could talk very freely to him, and he never imposed anything on us. So if you want me to say something nice, I'm saying it, but to say something nice about a person and to know that that person might have had good ideals does not bound you to them. I mean, I came to this country to have freedom of association. I reserve the right to talk to anyone. In this administration, in the next administration, in the administration before this, I reserve the right to talk to Americans, Israelis, Persians, even French. You know, yes, at any time and any point, I reserve the right to have friends from among radicals, leftist radicals, and many of them are my friends, most of them actually, and conservatives. The only thing that I would stand by is my principles. I won't compromise. If Paul Wolfowitz was a good dean at ʻsɛʁʒu, and if he believed in human rights, I did not agree with the war in Iraq. I did not agree with the war in Iraq before the war in Iraq started, when there was talk of it, and the first people I told were my friends who were conservatives. I felt it my duty to first announce my opposition to them before I would talk about it in public. And the more the war went on, of course, the more outrageous, like the rest of you, became. It's not a new story. And I leave it at that. People are using this in order to, you know, silence other matters about human rights. So the only politician I have publicly been, and I'm saying it even now with caution, I'm so scared of politicians. I'm saying it very, very, very conditionally, has been Obama. And the only reason for that is the question he brought up about attitude. If you're against the war in Iraq, that does not mean that your attitude is different from those who are for the war. Your attitude has to be different. If you're against the war for Iraq, you have to also be, yes, your mindset.
Mindset.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You have to also be for Iraqi people and anti-Saddam Hussein. If you are anti the war just because you're anti-Mr. Bush, then you have the same mentality. You have to have the kind of mentality that is different from the people you oppose. If I oppose Ahmadinejad, I don't want to overthrow him. I want to create a society that is different from him. And if he uses overthrow and violence, I'm against violence. And you have to be fundamentally different in order to be different. I'm sorry I went around that, but when you ask a question like that, you know, you get a preacher's voice. I mean, what did it really matter? If you read my articles and if you read what I've written, you would come to your conclusion. Why would you ask a question like that? I don't know.
Thank you. My name's Will Straw. I'm a Fulbright scholar at Columbia University. I wanted to ask Samantha about humanitarian intervention and the responsibility to protect. Last week, or earlier this week, George Bush was in Rwanda and said that he felt that the decision he made not to send American troops to Darfur was the right one. I wondered what you felt America's responsibility was in situations like Darfur and God forbid, a Rwanda of the future.
Thank you for that. That's again something that Sergio grappled with, hated the use of force initially, and then began to encounter circumstance upon circumstance where the mere presence of the UN Charter in your back pocket and the mere presence of peacekeepers or aid workers was not enough to deter anybody, and he ripened in the direction of becoming what in the 90s was called a humanitarian hawk, which I was also, in terms of seeing that there were certain regimes that, having negotiated with them at great length, were not actually going to stop murdering their civilians unless they were impeded in doing that. And just to close the loop on Sergio and then answer your question directly, one of the things that was really interesting was watching him, retrospectively, sadly, I wasn't in touch with him at the time, but in retrospect, watching him understand how to think about Iraq, having supported the use of force in Kosovo, having supported very proactive, almost militant rules of engagement for UN peacekeepers in East Timor. I should note that when José Ramos Horta was shot last week and nearly assassinated, the UN peacekeepers, from what I can gather, for the most part, stood around for quite a while, afraid because there was a guy with a gun to go near. That was Sergio created a very, very different climate where he tried to turn the UN peacekeepers into professional soldiers who saw themselves as having not just responsibilities to be present, but responsibilities, as you said, to protect. And sometimes protecting meant actually going into harm's way and so forth. And peacekeepers it's a very ambiguous category of soldier because they're told that they're not going in as warfighters, and yet violence is around them. And so these are not easy, again, balances to strike. But when Iraq came around, it was a huge challenge for him because, on the one hand, here was a dictator who had gassed his own people. Sergio was well familiar with that. There was no account in the UN, in the international system, by the French or the Germans or any of the vocal opponents of the war, or frankly in the anti-war movement here, by which people were saying how the Iraqi people would be helped, how their plights would be addressed if the war didn't happen. This was just, I'm just giving you an insight into his thought process. However, he was unconvinced that the team of people planning the war were motivated by humanitarian aims, and he thought that that would have predictive power. That is, the fact that the Iraqi people were sort of seventh on that long menu of reasons to go to war behind weapons of mass destruction, terrorism, oil, daddy, whatever all the things were, that the Iraqis were there somewhere, but that because they were down there, you would see the tanks parked in front of the oil ministry instead of the hospitals. You know, that there would be, so he was very sophisticated, as was Obama, I should say. You should go back to his October 2002 speech. It's not some knee-jerk anti-war speech. It's a really prophetic understanding both of what the effect would be in Afghanistan the effect on American families and the fact that there have been no shared sacrifice, like I talked about earlier, and very prophetic in terms of sectarian violence and how it would unfold and how little the interveners knew or cared about the people in whose name they were actually invading. But anyway, back to, so Sérgio then, but he had something deeply at stake in this war, which was the UN as well. And the UN I mean as not the building down the street, but also those ideals that were parked there, and the idea of a rule of law in the international system, which is often honored more in the breach than in practice. And he felt that this drubbing that the Bush administration was giving the UN system was one that would be really hard to recover from, and felt that to trample the Security Council, while the same thing a version of that had happened in Kosovo, he was more comfortable with it because there were prior UN Security Council resolutions. I mean, Bush tried to make this argument too that there were prior resolutions, but prior ones authorizing all necessary measures in the Kosovo context, and also that the NATO alliance supported the intervention in Kosovo. That doesn't satisfy a lot of people, I recognize, but for Sérgio, these were the compromises. When you had Russia, that was, as we see this week, standing so firmly behind Serbia, the odds of getting anything through the Security Council it was just structurally clogged, regardless of how much violence unfolded on the ground. Whereas his feeling was in the Iraq context that the case had just not been made, either that Saddam was intent of doing imminent major harm, sort of systematic genocidal mass atrocity harm to the Iraqi people. He had done it 15 years before, and that was a reason to watch him. Or that on the national security axis that there was an imminent threat. So I go into all this because, of course, now you have, if we thought the Vietnam syndrome was paralyzing of American political discourse, or the Somalia syndrome, some of you may remember that after the 1993 killings of US soldiers, the Iraq syndrome is this elephant in every room, and it's just an elephant with this big, it just sucks the air and the oxygen out of every discussion about how to help people in violent places right now. And it doesn't just render the concept of the responsibility to protect, which for those of you who don't know, it's this 150 countries came together in 2005 and endorsed this Canadian, Scandinavian norm, which was meant to be a move away from the idea of a right of intervention, which people in the developing world found so off-putting because they're like, we've heard that before. That sounds like, oh, I get to go in and take your oil and diamonds, and you get to help me take them. They were like, enough of that, and so some sort of middle powers decided, and Gareth Evans, the former Australian Foreign Minister, Mahmoud Sanoon, came together and said, let's talk instead about responsibilities, and let's talk instead, make the states feel okay about sovereignty, let them know that they have the first and primary responsibility to protect civilians, and then if they abdicate that responsibility, then and only then does that responsibility responsibility to protect vest to the international community and the system as a whole. So amazingly, in 2005, the concept that you mentioned gets enshrined just in the nick of time, insofar as it was seen, the polarization has been with us, of course, well, before even 9/11, but it's just been widening in the world. But in 2005, in the developing world, there was still a desire to say, okay, we all have Rwanda in our minds, not just the United States or the Rwandans who have Rwanda in their minds. Let's acknowledge this concept so we retain control of our own destinies, but also acknowledge the importance of human rights and civilian protection. That's 2005. Iraq is a disaster, but it's not quite what it's become. It's a sucking sound, but it's not taking all the oxygen out of the room. But what was very clear in the decision by 150 countries to endorse this concept is that there wasn't one, at least that I could see, that had any intention of actually exercising the responsibility to protect. They were willing to declare it barely, just in the nick of time, and create this norm maybe as a placeholder for a coming age or a coming century, who knows. But to exercise it, to put their troops, their police in harm's way, their peacekeepers, it just wasn't, they weren't serious. And Iraq has given them an alibi. Because domestically in their countries, and I'm talking about democracies and middle powers like Canada and Scandinavia, the people who introduced the concept, their publics hear about Darfur and they think, ugh, Iraq. They don't think of Iraq as, oh, okay, there's an example of how awful things can get when you go to war with no international support, don't do any planning, don't have any Arabic speakers, don't think about the morning after, You know, they don't seal the borders, de-Ba'athify, demobilize. I mean, they don't take the lessons of Iraq. They generalize as an excuse to do, or I should say to not do, what they don't want to do anyway. I mean, they don't themselves have any of the domestic pressure that the Bush administration is under from students and Hotel Rwanda watchers and evangelicals and Jewish groups in this country. They're not facing that kind of pressure. So this concept, this norm, is moribund. It's just, there's no politics to support it in a bottom-up way. And this is, again, the misconception of the UN that I hope the book, anybody who reads the book anyway, will stop talking about the UN as if it has a mind and a body and a bank account of its own and start to disaggregate the nations in the ununited or disunited or whatever nations. It's the nations who will decide whether to go to Darfur. And in brief, to this actual point about Darfur, the Bush administration should not have sent troops, in my judgment. There's disagreement in the advocacy community on this. I think that given how overstretched the U.S. military is as a practical matter, and that you have people on their 4th and 5th tours, and that the military is almost broken in this country, given the level of suspicion of U.S. motives around the world right now, a suspicion that will persist until we change an awful lot of what has gone wrong in the last 7 years, and even that which was going on before. We have to win trust back, given the amount of suspicion, especially in the Islamic world and the Arab world, and given the likelihood that if we showed up there, the jihadis would follow. And the only thing worse than genocide is genocide plus Al-Qaeda, I promise you, for the people of Darfur. And that is, for me, as a increasing consequentialist as I get older, thinking that through, it just seemed to me that the risks outweighed the benefits. But that said, that doesn't mean you then close the toolbox and say, well, we're feeding the refugees, we're giving out the sandwiches at the gates of Auschwitz. Check that box, I'll get to say that when I go to Rwanda, that we've given $3 billion. No. You can still, for all of the loss of U.S. influence in the world, there's still an enormous amount of unharnessed leverage, and we're not serious about Darfur. The political pressure has got Bush to give the aid, to push at the Security Council for a peacekeeping force of 26,000, but not to do the diplomacy and the hard work of going door to door to try to get other countries to contribute the troops that are needed. So in other words, it's one thing to say, it's very easy for me to sit here and say, no, if American troops went, the moral hazards would be too great. But then it's question begging, because it's, okay, well then who's going to go? When is the politics in other countries going to move away from just throwing daggers at George Bush toward actually tending to the kinds of problems that Sergio, who's the only 21st century statesman I've encountered in a long time, who's actually thinking ahead to this issue of brokenness and undergoverned spaces and failing states and failed states. No one's owning this stuff. And it's so convenient. I mean, this is why Obama or Senator Clinton, they're going to present major challenges. Obama especially in my view, because if he does the things that he has pledged he will do and that I believe he will do, even though it'll take longer inevitably than he would like, it then puts the spotlight back on other people and how they have not stepped in to fill the void of, whether you want to call it moral leadership or protection leadership, civilian, dignity leadership, freedom from fear leadership. There are no other competitors like looking to take over that job. As Obama said about a year ago in a speech, the position of leader of the free world is vacant. The White House is occupied, but the position of leader of the free world is vacant. And that was a dig not only at Bush, but also at the people who are standing back and watching these kinds of atrocities persist and watching states fail, pulling out of Afghanistan because it's too dangerous in certain areas. I mean, it is dangerous. But the Taliban, both from a national security perspective and from a rights perspective, the lack of responsibility taking out there, or the responsibility deficit, let me call it, among middle powers, and of course China, Russia, it goes without saying, and the United States. Right now we've got a void, and it's very dangerous.
Well, I hate to ask you another question after speaking for so long, but this is going to go to you, Ms. Power. My name is Jordan Hirsch. I'm a student at Columbia University also. And you recently said, I think it was recently in an interview about concerning the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, one of your policy proposals, or what you would tell the future President Obama would be to send in a mammoth protection force of American troops to kind of impose. Is that not? That's what you've been accused of saying.
Yes, indeed.
Okay. So I'm asking, how would you respond to that, and what would you prescribe to solve the conflict? And why is it that you see the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as central to fixing the problems that are, all the problems that associate with the Middle East?
Yeah, I'm having a bad few weeks in terms of ellipses and dates and the elisions and the kinds of stuff, just as Obama's having a hard time, has had a hard time and has much more at stake, obviously, and having a hard time with ridiculous allegations of him praying on the Quran or, you know, not taking the Pledge of Allegiance and so forth. But anyway, I've now got a few problems as well. That interview was, it was in 2002, and what it was in the context of was a debate that was going on right then and there. If there was no fence at that time, there were no there was much more porousness between Palestinian territories and Israel proper. And there was a debate about if you had a peace, would there be, how would that peace ever get enforced? How would you ever create confidence for long enough for a peace to stick? So all I can imagine, it was so long ago, is that what I was talking about is peacekeepers who might have the trust of both sides. The world has changed an awful lot since then, and I wouldn't recommend that at all today. But I do think the question still stands, which is who would have the trust of both sides? And if you have an agreement, how do you have an agreement where Israel is fully secure and where Palestinians are not so irredentist and so wanting to undo the agreement that that security is jeopardized? So some question of what the frontier is and how that's patrolled, I think, persists. But let me be clear, there's no imposition, there's no, I mean, the hope of, again, of the United States restoring its leadership, its credibility on moral issues, on geopolitical issues, its competence deficit now is as important as its legitimacy deficit in that region and in other regions, but is to create good offices, and sustained offices, not as an afterthought when you're looking for your legacy with time running out, but from the beginning of your presidency, right with the responsible withdrawal from Iraq, has to be to put the Arab-Israeli, you have to walk and chew gum at the same time. You got to close Guantanamo, you got to stop talking, you got to stop doing rendition, you got to stop waterboarding, you got to return to the Geneva Convention. You've got to do all those things in order to be credible as a negotiator. I mean, you've probably heard this from others, but don't believe everything you read on the internet, especially in a political season. But it has to be central. It cannot be an afterthought, and it's something Obama there are A priorities, and with dealing with getting out of Iraq, being engaged from the start on the Arab-Israeli situation is priority number one.
I want to feed your ego for 1 minute before I ask a question, Dr. Powers. When I got up this morning and Googled the New York Public Library website to check the time of this event, when I scrolled down to it, it said, sold out. There will be a standby line. And I said, wow. The only time I can remember only 3 sold-out political events in my entire lifetime. Two were at Cornell University in that huge Bailey Hall in 1957. And they were Eleanor Roosevelt and Norman Thomas. And the next one was the day after Paul Tsongas won the New Hampshire primary, and there was a humongous Greek bash at the Crystal Palace in Astoria, just across the river. And this is number 4. It's really quite amazing. You have quite a constituency in the United States, and I'm honored to be a part of it, and you've done pretty well.
The night is young. Yeah.
Exactly. You said you were a consequentialist. I hadn't heard that one before. I want to draw a line between the bomb that killed Sergio on January 21st, 2009, when there's 54 46% chance you'll be sitting at a table in a building 200 miles south. And the new president says, George McGovern says that if we pull out of Iraq, it'll be like Vietnam, when everyone predicted there would be horrendous bloodshed and massacre, and it didn't happen. And at the other extreme, there's John McCain, who says we should stay there and continue this for 50 to 100 years. Well, this is day one. What do we do? And they go around the table, the Vice President, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, the yada, the yada, the yada, the...
I'll be in another building. If I'm in a building, it won't be that building. It'll be an outhouse, like somewhere, you know...
This is a fantasy.
I will indulge it for the evening.
In the other building, what's your answer to the question? Do we pull out on day one? Do we stay 50 to 100 years? Do we do what? And at what cost in human lives and bloodshed? Do 5,000 people get killed or 100,000?
Okay, thank you. I mean, thank you for everything you've said. Yeah, do you want to get a bunch of questions and then so everybody has a chance to... Yeah, that'd be great.
3 people.
But I will absolutely answer that.
But you know, you remember.
Yes.
Good evening. As a United Nations staff member, a colleague and personal friend of Sérgio Vieira de Mello, who served with him in the field for many years, I would like to bring back Sérgio the person as a person of ideas, as a global citizen that was raised in many countries as a son of diplomats, and bring back this evening to the idea of a collective evolutionary consciousness, into the transcendence of nation states, into the idea of the United Nations. And I want the comments of both of you beyond the politics of this one country on what Sérgio stood for and what we that work in the field stand for, which is transcending all these ideas of elections and power and empires, and finding the commonality and finding the solutions, and in what way one gets, you know, what you see as the way to get there, not the way to resolve the political problems of any given country, but finding the global idea of who we are as people.
Good evening. A question about the challenges you face, Ms. Powers, as you toe the line between academia and policy. I think I know some of the answers, but I'd love to hear your comments.
Great. Should I do the 3 and then? Yeah. Okay, so this will discipline the speaker somewhat, hopefully. First of all, the first questioner asking about, or initially saying that this was a sold-out event and that was a great thing. I can assure you that if there was any danger of me getting a big head by this incredible evening, spending time with Barack Obama will make me feel about this big. I mean, he had 20,000 people in Boise, Idaho, waiting in the snow for blocks around the block, you know, miles around the block. But there is, I think this is, and Obama would say the same thing. It's not about, I mean, I hope it's about Sérgio up to a point. It's not about me. It is this sense that we're not getting what we need, I don't think. It's a sense that we're off and that we keep having the same conversations and litigating the same old, same old. Even the way Sérgio is being read, it's frustrating by some. It's people still want to ask, you know, should the U.S. be the world's policeman? How should the UN be reformed? I mean, these are all important questions, but if we can orient ourselves around the problems and the challenges and the values, and this gets to the second comment question, and start there, then the means will follow. If we stay tweaking the means, we're going to be in trouble for a long time. So I see this as part of what one encounters in a lot of places, and I think part of how Obama has surprised a lot of people, because I think he's tapping it. To your specific question about getting out of Iraq on day one, one of the things Barack did that is he busted out of the false dichotomy that you rightly identified, and I would go further even, as you've described. You have McCain saying, if we leave Iraq, it'll make Rwanda look like a picnic. But in my view anyway, telling no story about how we in the medium to long term, or in his, leave aside his long term of 100 years, but let's say in the medium term, how we stop civilian massacres, how we create a political process that's viable, how we create incentives so people come to the table in a way that they haven't yet with the American troops there. So you have that on that side, which I think is inadequate, but then on the, that's on the right side, I suppose, on the left, and people want to get out, there is a comparable narcissism. I mean, the McCain idea is somehow we're responsible for any reduction in violence. No acknowledgement of Muqtada al-Sadr's ceasefire. Very little acknowledgement of the diplomacy and the work that the Sunni tribal chiefs are doing and you know, their role in that. I mean, saying that we're facilitating it, but it's all about us. And similarly, sometimes on the left, you know, and I'm for withdrawal, but it's as if we're responsible for all the problems of the world. And yes, we made a fair percentage of the problems in Iraq. Without us, I don't know what percent of the problems wouldn't be happening right now. There'd be Saddam Hussein, and that would be its own problem. But these problems followed our arrival there, and we are responsible. But it is not the case that the cause of a lot of that harm, leaving, renders the harm obsolete. And so, again, I know I sound like I'm part of a cult of Obama, but what made him so different was he said, okay, we're getting out. I believe we have to get out for our national interest in order to deal with al-Qaeda elsewhere, in order to fix our military, in order to bring these men and women home from a dumb war. But I want to convene a working group. I want you know, a lot of great minds to come together and tell me, how do I do this responsibly? So I wouldn't have to say much in any imagined meeting, because I think he's already laid out a plan. It's going to sound unsatisfying. It's incommensurate to the risk of violence, I will say that. I think that's structurally the case. It's all lesser evil terrain right now. But it's give the Iraqi people ample, fair notice, specific notice. People in mixed neighborhoods who want to move, sadly, to homogenous neighborhoods, facilitate the transport if that's what's required. Create a war crimes commission, either through the UN or through some other body. Right now, massacres occur left and right, and no one debriefs a survivor of a massacre. No one's trying to create a list of names of people, at least to make it harder for them to travel regionally, and try to bring in some of the neighbors in the conversation about how do you punish people who are responsible for these crimes. Some of this will sound very naive, but we're not even having these conversations. The Iraqis are nowhere part of the debate about staying or going. Refugee assistance. The borders are closed. Syria's taken 1 million Iraqi refugees. How many have we taken now in this country? I'm sure someone has the latest number, 2,000. You know, a tenth of the number that Sweden has taken. I can't even do what's 2,000 to 1 million, what Syria has taken. It's an embarrassment, a national embarrassment. So freeing up the asylum issues, but also understanding that Iraq's neighbors and the influx of this very combustible population of aggrieved people suffering, undignified, humbled, broken people is not going to do anybody in the region any favors. And this is a national security issue and a strategic issue as much as it is a humanitarian issue. The borders aren't going to open up until those countries get assistance, until we have a massive overture in order to make that happen. And somehow, and this is the hardest part, how do you deal when you leave with also getting assistance to the internally displaced? Because just as the external borders are closed, so too now the governorates within Iraq are closed and people are trapped. So the answers to these questions, these are sort of abstract categories of thought until you actually sit down with the generals. But those conversations are very much rooted in an understanding of America's responsibility to the Iraqi people. I'm going to do the third question next very briefly, the toeing the line between academia and policy. It's challenging. It's what can I say? It's a nightmare. It's hard. I mean, because I mean, luckily Obama is somebody that there's very, very little daylight between what I would say as me and what I say as a surrogate for him. I mean, I couldn't do what I'm doing. I couldn't talk like this. I'm just can't do that somehow. My parents are here. They will attest to that. It's just I couldn't do that. So there's not as much tension as I'd imagine there is, but as you see people now going back and cherry-picking my writings from before I was an advisor to Obama as a way of getting at Obama, it breaks my heart. That's something I would have said in 2000 in a totally different context would hurt Obama, you know, when all I'm trying to do is help him. I hate it. I just hate it. And I wish people would stop. And if any of you are doing it, please stop. And then finally to the wonderful question I want Azar to respond to. You know, how do we create this, sort of what I was getting at about knowing what our end state is, what our values are that can unite us across borders. And I think dignity has more promise in it these days than democracy or even than rights. I mean, when you think about China, when you think about Middle Eastern societies, just maybe there's something to that. It may sound very mild and like a bromide or whatever, but I think something very important in that. But just speaking self-servingly for a second, I want Sergio to be the, as you suggested, to show us how off we are in these political. I mean, I speak in terms of politics and how we got to put pressure, you know, within member states in order to change what the UN can achieve and get resources for this or that. And I apologize for that, but it's an effort also to move beyond the simple transcendence, which hasn't gotten us far enough. It's to try to be, I think what Sergio tried to be as well, was just sort of a little bit of a Machiavellian idealist. But I think you're absolutely right to push back and say, but if we're all in the weeds of this electoral district and whether this country, you know, that we miss the point. And the self-serving part is I'm hoping Sergio can be the face for those principles, which partly because of the neocon adventurism, partly because 60 years of having the UN, of course, hasn't stopped the things that we would love to see stopped in the world, the amount of pain and humiliation and suffering. But so with Sergio, I'm hoping not only that there's the book, there's I don't know if he's here, but Greg Barker, incredible documentary filmmaker, Emmy and DuPont award-winning filmmaker, is doing a documentary about August 19th and what was at stake. August 19th is the day that Sergio was killed with 21 others. What was at stake in that mission? What was lost? What can be gained in revisiting it? And then Terry George, who was the director of Hotel Rwanda, is doing a major Hollywood biopic on Sergio. So this isn't satisfactory, and I hope Azar has a better answer to the spirit of your question, but I think that what we also need are models, new models. I mean, all of our, we all talk about global threats and challenges and global warming, global disease and counterterrorism and everything crosses borders and refugees, but all of our models and our heroes, flawed though they may be, are 20th century, even 19th century models. So maybe by walking in the footsteps of somebody who's grappling with these immense challenges, but from the standpoint of chasing the flame, seeing the flame that you're describing that unites all of you who put your lives on the line for this kind of work, there can be a contagion effect, that it can legitimate talking about the flame again and where we're heading, that there's guidance somehow in him and in that.
I agree with you. I just wanted to also, the lady from United Nations, when you mentioned Sergio, one reason that you start talking about him and then you're sidetracked and you go and talk about other issues is because his life story, both as a man and as an activist or as a UN man, brings out an essential paradox that we live in the world today, that the paradox that exists in him as a philosopher, as a serious philosopher who's when he's in Rwanda or in I don't know Cambodia, he's reading Kant's critique of reason, you know, as a refuge, and he wants to implement Kant. At the same time, he's a man of action. He goes to Cambodia and he has a problem on his hands, how to move the refugees, how to deal with Khmer Rouge. He represents the paradox as a man. And then UN itself represents the paradox. I think it's Article 3, Paragraph 7 of the UN, which talks about the sovereignty of the states in UN, that all these states have the say there. The paradox is the Declaration of Human Rights in the US. The states themselves a lot of times are responsible for violating the human rights, and yet they talk about it. So this is a paradox every one of us in this room is facing today. Whether we're American, whether we're Iranian, French again, you know, or wherever we come, whether we're dealing with Darfur or whether we're dealing with Iran or Afghanistan, we need to deal with this paradox. And the other thing I wanted to say, Samantha mentioned Iraq. I think the time has come about Iraq for either those who are for it or against it to stop being self-righteous. You know, we all feel so good because we can bash the other and call them all sorts of names and blame him. And that's why I reacted to the issue related to Paul Wolfowitz in that manner. I think we are now coming to the point where we need to stop blaming one another. There are blames. There is accountability rather than blame. That is what matters. And we need to learn. When the war in Iraq started, not just the new conservatives, many people who were liberal, who were anti this administration, people who were human rights activists, were pro-war. The question remains, why? Wasn't it because the war in Iraq didn't start 6 years ago, or I don't know even how many years anymore, 2003?
Yeah.
5 years ago. The war in Iraq had its roots to the problems that Sergio was going through from Lebanon. Beginning in 1970s and Lebanon, it has its roots in those problems. It came out here. Some human rights activists were so disgusted with the attack on the Kurdish Iraqis, the chemical bombing of villages, and they did not see any peaceful way of dealing with this, and so they went for the war. If they were wrong, the intentions were good, and we need to still respond to the paradox. I think this is just the beginning, and I say that those the human rights. You have people like Michael Ignatius,
right, who were
or Christopher Hitchens. You mentioned these people did not have any. They did not benefit from being pro-war. I don't think they did. They did not benefit from being pro-war. All their reputation was on the line because they went for this war. We should understand that there is a problem which needs to be solved even if US pulls out. And that is why Sergio and the paradox that he brings to us and the problem of dealing with evil in a way that we would not become evil ourselves, I think that is what we need to debate in our academia. Not in a political way, but in other ways as well as in our politics. I think that is my hope, at least. I don't know if it's going to work.
It's a perfect way. That's it.
You need to take over.
I have a question for yes, Samantha, you can comment on this, but before you comment on this, I'm just wondering, I'd like to ask this of both of you, what's with the French?
What is with the French? Now, I think we should ponder upon that for a while.
Both bring them up.
Yes.
And even the French.
The whole point is to create questions about it.
All right.
I mean, if you're serious, I will say...
Of course, all of them serious.
Always. One of the things that I'd actually like to put a footnote to my account of how nobody wants to exercise this responsibility to protect, and I mean, the French are everywhere. They put their troops in harm's way all the time. They're in Chad. They helped prevent a coup sponsored by the Sudanese government 2-3 weeks ago. So the French, there's no shortage of engagement, but this is one of the, and I hate to do this now after this woman rightly sort of said, but what about the ideals and why are we so in the politics of statecraft and realpolitik and so forth? But there's this gap in the world because there are states who have too little interests at stake. I mean, the UN in some ways, the conceit was that at the founding, if there were 51 countries, that not any one of the 51 countries would really care that much about people victimized by, let's say, the Khmer Rouge or the next Hitler. They wouldn't care as such enough. It wouldn't be in their national interest. But if you could add up a little bit of interest from each of the 51 states and gather it, that would be enough for interest, for something to get done. And now we have 192 countries. It's sort of the same logic that you just peel off a little bit of interest, you implicate people just enough, and that you can somehow create a race to the top, whereas instead it ends up being often kind of lowest common denominator. So what you have are states who are either insufficiently interested, so it doesn't tap the politics, it's not politically rewarding, it doesn't reward national security or economics and so forth, or they're too interested, they're at stake in some fashion. And I think the French are now, they're involved in a range of ways because of a colonial heritage, because of a sense of pride of certain countries, but often their stakeholders in the countries that they're active in. So at a time when so few countries want to be in dangerous places, I find myself often relieved that the French are still willing to actually play a global role. I mean, really, they're quite unique in that way. There's a whole apartheid in peacekeeping where rich countries pay for it. If you look at the 17 UN missions that exist around the world, rich countries pay for it, and countries like Bangladesh, Nigeria, Rwanda, Nepal, they're the ones who do it. And because they get hard currency and the soldiers, there's a you know, and because their countries have a certain amount of pride now in being part of it. But the missions that are going to result from that kind of apartheid are not going to be ones that bring about the kinds of results that Sergio would have been looking for. So I think that there is something actually positive to be said about the French. The question is how to harness the French enthusiasm for being abroad around you know, kind of global ambitions, around the commons, and not simply just around French national interest and French pride. I mean, that's a hell of an answer, I must say, for a question that was not even a real question.
Also, you expect so much of the French. They were the ones who gave us Johnny Guitar and Marx Brothers. They were the ones who, through their interpretation of
don't forget the rights of man.
You know, and they can interpret you right out of existence. So we're a little afraid of the French. And
maybe one other very quick question for you, Samantha, which was included, alluded to in some way in my introduction, which is what happens to ideals when they hit the road. And you are on the road now a lot with Barack Obama, and do you feel that he needs to accommodate his points of view to various interest groups that change, in a way, his idealism and his basic ideals?
Again, these concepts, I mean, you know, I gave you the suggestion of the perils of idealism, and I see Sergio, this book in some ways, or even in my own life, is like the education of an idealist, you know, the kind of peeling away of I mean, just the accommodation of the real world. It's idealism in practice. But while Obama has this incredible force of personality and power of oratory, obviously, in some ways it's a distraction. I mean, when you're talking about becoming president or governing, you're talking about healthcare, you're talking about mortgage crises, you're talking about getting out of Iraq responsibly. If you're on the other side, you're talking about staying in Iraq forever. Whatever these are, going into public service is, you know, going into government is the mark of your idealism, because there's plenty of things Obama could be doing. He keeps winning Grammys. He could just write books and win Grammys going forward. So the form is idealistic, but the problems are very practical, and they're very rooted in reality and real concerns. So are there interest groups pushing him left and right? Is it hard? Yes, but that's what makes it so amazing, that though he's raised more money than anyone in the history of American politics, something like 60% of it has come from donors who've given under $300. I have to check that number. But I mean, that's so freeing. And he's not taking federal lobbyist money. He's not taking PAC money. He's doing what he can in this process. We've got to get money out of politics. We all know that. It's not a level playing field. But what's amazing is that even though he didn't have the structural advantages going in, because he had the message that resonated with this yearning, he's been able to offset, you know, the advantages that other candidates had, and thus is going to be far less beholden than any other, if he becomes president, than any president in American, since money got into politics in the first place in modern American history.
Azana Fisi, Samantha Power, thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you.
Samantha Power is a professor at Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government. She's the author of A Problem from Hell, America and the Age of Genocide, which was awarded the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Critics Circle Award. For more, visit ksg.harvard.edu and search her name.
In the riots, he joined the UN at age 21, and then, as I said, moved with the headlines. So if in the 70s, the conflicts that were consuming the world were wars of decolonization and so forth, he was the guy dealing with the humanitarian consequences of those. So he was in Bangladesh in the early 70s, he was in Cyprus right after the invasion there. He was in Sudan when the civil war started there, which we're still dealing with to this day. Mozambique, the War of Independence. And he would spend a year, 2 years, 6 months in these places. He called this period of his life the grocery delivery period. It was humanitarian aid. He was, in some ways, always aware that there was a danger of passing out sandwiches at the gates of Auschwitz. Then a turning point for him comes, and this is the unreasonable, I think gets to your question directly, when he's in Lebanon in 81, from 81 to 83. Palestinians are staging raids out of southern Lebanon, attacks into northern Israel. The Israelis decide they're going to respond by invading southern Lebanon and getting rid of what had been a UN buffer, because the buffer wasn't doing any good. The attacks were coming. And Sérgio was, like the rest of the UN, kind of trampled by the invasion. Only one fatality, but an awful lot of indignity in the process. And he went marching up to the Israeli commander who had come into southern Lebanon, who was standing in front of a tank at a sort of corner, and Sérgio said, "What you're doing, this invasion, this is unacceptable." And the general just looked at this little Brazilian UN guy and said, "If you think this is unacceptable, you should see the 50 tanks that are pulling up the rear here. That's unacceptable." And Sérgio said from that point on, he would never use the word unacceptable again. This idea that there was a standard of reason that could be applied. And just briefly, just because not everybody knows Sérgio. So after Lebanon, he was then after southern Lebanon, he was in Beirut in 83 when the Marine barracks, when the US embassy was hit by the first suicide bomber, Hezbollah. It later emerged. And then the Marine barracks were hit. Wall falls in 1989. He's the guy sent to kind of clean up the consequences of the Cold War proxy wars. He's the one sent to negotiate with the Khmer Rouge. The Problem from Hell is about that in large measure. But the UN was the symptom of the international community's indifference is too strong, but insufficient regard for these people. And so I was told that there was this one kind of exceptional character within this otherwise faltering, unimpressive mission, and that was a person who was a cross between Bobby Kennedy on the one hand and James Bond on the other. And I thought, wow, you know, that doesn't sound like a UN profile to me. Let me go and find this person, and we met and became friends over the years. He was a guy whose life moved with the headlines. Wherever the world's worst crises were, Sérgio was. And what's interesting is a biography of Sérgio does indeed end up being a biography of the world of the last 35 years. So he was a Brazilian. His father was fired by the Brazilian Foreign Service when the military took over there in a coup. Sérgio thus developed this attitude about Brazil, which is that even though he spoke 7 languages and became a great diplomat, he would never work for his country. He would never work for the state. He didn't trust states. He didn't trust politics. In 1968, he was in Paris doing philosophy work at the Sorbonne and became part of the student riots. And he hated imperialism. He hated the United States. He hated the state. He continues to hate the state as an abstraction. And he would, even when he would see an American car in Europe, he would bend over and pretend as if he was picking up stones and kind of hurl them, imaginary stones, at these cars. And if he heard an American accent, he would get up and leave the table. But for him, the alternative to the state, and this was his first act of unreasonableness perhaps, was, or of naivete in some ways, the alternative to the state and to politics for him was the UN in his youthful mind. The idea was the UN was the place we parked our principles. That was where we were supposed to hold states accountable or prevent them from being state-like. And so he was drawn, and having been expelled from Paris by virtue of involvement.
Go to booktv.org. Until recently, Samantha Power was a foreign policy advisor to Barack Obama. The Pulitzer Prize-winning author discusses her latest book, Chasing the Flame. It talks about the life and work of UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Sérgio Vieira de Mello. The event, hosted by the New York Public Library, is 90 minutes.
To the stage now, it is my pleasure to ask you to warmly welcome Azar Nafisi, together with Senior Foreign Policy Advisor to Barack Obama, Samantha Power.
Is this James Bond?
Spoken like an Iranian.
I very much look forward to that one. I think that we should sort of try to bring him in some way. It is wonderful to be here and hopefully to have a wonderful conversation between us and with you. I thought that maybe I'll begin by asking you a question. And halfway through reading Samantha's new book, Chasing the Flame, all of a sudden I remembered something from a book that she doesn't like me to mention, which is A Problem from Hell, her previous book. I thought that the last sentences in Problem from Hell would be a fantastic introduction to Chasing the Flame. And so I want to begin with that. I don't know if you remember the end of your book, do you? Okay. I always try to forget the beginning and the end of mine. She says, this is the very, very last part. She says, George Bernard Shaw once wrote, "The reasonable man adapts himself to the world. The unreasonable one persists in trying to adapt the world to himself. Therefore, all progress depends on the unreasonable man." So I thought that, you know, in talking about this book and in talking about a character like Sérgio de Mello, and we will be going into his character much more, how would he fit into this description? Was he an unreasonable man? Does this description in any way tell us something about your book or him?
Wow, it's a great question. First of all, let me say that this audience is incredible. I'm so honored by it. I think Azar is as well. Of course, we hope that everybody's here because the perils of idealism are on everyone's mind, and you care about Sergio or you love Azar.
And hate you.
And hate me. I'm sure there are a few Obama people out here as well, and we will acknowledge that that might be part of the draw, but, and I'm sure we'll get to Obama, who has an awful lot in common, actually, with Sergio in certain ways. But you asked a great question. I think that on the one hand, so first a word about who Sergio was, because the book's only been out, I think, 2 or 3 days. This was a guy who I think the James Bond music was in honor of Sergio, in fact. Before I met him, I was in the former Yugoslavia, in the Balkans in 1994, and the UN mission there was something of a disaster. Peacekeepers had been put into harm's way on the logic that simply by being there, they would deter attacks against civilians. They weren't mandated to really use force in order to protect civilians, and the people intent on committing aggression were also intent on using force. So the peacekeepers were mainly there delivering humanitarian aid, and as I think Henri Lévy described it as passing out sandwiches at the gates of Auschwitz. That was what the UN was said to be doing. So I was a journalist, I was young, I was maybe shrill, I found it very disturbing what we in the world were allowing happen to these innocent to stare into the eyes of evil and figure out what the hell do you do with them now that there's a peace, now that the US and the Soviets are no longer backing different sides and even the Chinese are out of it. Now Cambodia is just stuck with itself and with the residue. So he had to decide how to negotiate with them. Then when I met him in the 90s, people remember, some people here are too young now to remember, but the big issue was ethnic conflict and Isaiah Berlin's bent twig, you know, under when societies had been closed, and then you open them and then the twig snaps and you get all this killing. So he was in Bosnia for 2 years. He was in Rwanda and in the Congo, figuring out what do you do with the genocidaires who are involved with the genocide, and then go into neighboring countries amid civilians, amid 2 million civilians who, some number of whom haven't done anything, but a lot of whom were involved in the genocide. How do you separate the sheep from the wolves? You had to kind of figure that out. And then to finally getting near the present, nation, I mean, this guy is insane. The nation-building experiments of the late 1990s, Sergio was the Jerry Bremer predecessor, the sort of equivalent of Bremer, the viceroy in Kosovo, which is in the news today, and in East Timor, which is sadly in the news today. Then, of course, he becomes Human Rights Commissioner, has to figure out what do you do with George Bush and Guantanamo and the Geneva Conventions and rendition. Do you denounce him from afar as a UN guy, or do you try to get in the room? Sergio's preference was always to be in the room, and then culminating, of course, in Iraq. Now, that's a biography, but so he's everywhere. Now, I wouldn't have known he was in half these places when I met him. He wasn't one of these macho, he was macho, but he wasn't one of the macho guys who kind of lords their war experience over you. But I think what makes him amazing is he actually believed that you could reason with the Khmer Rouge. You could reason with Muqtada al-Sadr. You could reason with George Bush, not to put Muqtada and George Bush in the same. That was not intentional. But the point is, people that everybody else would deem unreasonable in profound ways, I think perhaps there was a hubris to him in exaggerating the power of reason. And arguably, and we'll get to it later, I assume, but when he's blown up